Today we're going to talk some about an attitude of cynicism at the turn of the century. We'll be discussing the contrast between realism and idealism again, and also its effect on values. And we'll examine the works of George Bernard Shaw, specifically an appendix to Man and Superman called Maxims for Revolutionists. Before that, I want to talk some about a Bertrand Russell article on denoting that revolutionized philosophy right around the same time. Sadly, the link on the webpage doesn't work. I don't know why, but I'll fix that. But it's just as well you haven't read it, because you wouldn't have been able to make any sense of it anyway. However, after this, I think you'll be able to read it and be happy and feel like you understand it. At least I hope so. Parts of it you may think, wait, he didn't talk about this part. That's fine, skip it. In fact, there is this long section where he talks about Gray's elegy. No one understands what he's talking about, okay? I mean, they know the poem, Gray's Elegy, famous poem, okay? But the argument, as far as people can tell, makes no sense. There are long, complicated articles about it. A few people think it can be rescued. Most people think it's nonsense. So I've omitted that entirely. And actually, I think I dropped it out of this reading, but if you come upon this text in another place, you'll see all this stuff about Gray's Elegy. It's long, it's complicated, it's nonsense, so ignore it. In any case, we will talk about, first of all, Bertrand Russell's article on denoting. Russell was Lord Russell. He was born into a very highly placed British family. He was the godson of John Stuart Mill, and he ended up teaching for most of his career at Cambridge. Well, I say most of his career, most of his academic career. At a certain point, he lost his job. City University in New York tried to hire him. He was so controversial that they managed to, basically regents and the public defeated that plan. And so he ended up supporting himself by writing books throughout most of his career. He wrote a lot of popular books like Why I'm Not a Christian and a variety of things about war and peace and so on, as well as more philosophical books. And almost anybody who is schooled in contemporary philosophy has studied a lot of Russell. These were just things I happen to have on my shelf, for example. Now, the article we're going to be discussing appeared in October 1905 in Mind, Britain's leading philosophical journal, then and now, actually. And as you can see, it stands out in a certain way. Pragmatism versus absolutism, predetermination, personal endeavor, is humanism a philosophical advance? All these things related to what was a popular way of thinking about philosophy at the turn of the century, namely idealism. And since idealism was originally developed in Germany, you can see the dependence of British philosophy on German philosophy. Critical notices, that is book reviews. Look, all the books are in German. Okay, so British philosophy at the time very much saw itself as a handmaiden to German philosophy. But there is Russell's little article on denoting. It would have struck people as bizarre at the time if they paid any attention at all, for a number of reasons. One of them is, it's striking a blow for realism, or at least it's trying to. As we'll see, it doesn't go as far as people initially thought it does, but nevertheless, it strikes a blow for realism against the dominant idealism of the time. It doesn't really seem to be on a philosophical topic at all. In fact, it's on a sort of linguistic matter, the meaning of the word the. And it's often thought to be the beginning of analytic philosophy, which is the dominant school of philosophy now in Britain and the United States and other English-speaking countries. Analytic philosophers stress the importance of clarity, stress logical structure, stress argumentation. And all of that gets its beginnings with some figures in the 19th century, like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and Gottlob Frege, but really becomes a standard way of doing philosophy, starting with this article on denoting. Now, what is the topic of it, on denoting? He talks about it as being denoting phrases, but unfortunately he never really gives us a definition of a denoting phrase. What does he mean exactly? All he gives us are some examples. A man, some man, any man, every man, all men, the present king of England, the present king of France, and so on. Linguists today would call these noun phrases or determiner phrases, determiners being words like, well, some, any, every, all, etc. And importantly, the. Now really, it turns out that this is a paper about definite descriptions. It is a paper about the meaning of the word the. And Russell at one point says, I think this is so important that I would endeavor to give a theory of that word even if I were dead from the neck down. Now why? Most of you are probably sitting there thinking, if I were dead from the neck down and knew I had only moments to live, the last thing I would want to do was develop a theory of the word the. But he thought it was that important. Now why? Well, he sees definite descriptions as one of the key ways in which language and indirectly thought relate to the world. So the idea is this. We say things about the world all the time. I can say, it's muggy outside, and I'm talking about the world in some fashion. That's not a way that involves a definite description, but I can easily do that. I can say, the students are attentive, for example, and what am I referring to? The students is the idea. A group of you, perhaps, if I'm talking about this classroom. And so, the phrases might be thought to be one of the key ways in which language and thought link up to the world. Now, there are other ways. I might just say, look at that, or I might use a proper name. And so, names, demonstratives like this and that, those are also ways in which language seems to hook up to the world. When I say it's muggy, the it somehow links up to the world too. So the is only one of the ways of doing this, but nevertheless he thinks it's a very important way. So the background question of this article really is, how does our thought relate to the world? What is the connection between mind and world, between my thinking and the way the world out there really is? Notice the world out there really is, that presupposes a sort of realist picture. There's my mind and the thoughts I have, and then there's the world, and it's independent of me and my thoughts. Now, thoughts are kind of hard to grasp in themselves, but at least often we can express them in language. And so, Russell's strategy is to focus on language. He says maybe we can understand how language relates to the world, and thereby get some insight into how thought relates to the world. This is often considered the beginning of what is known as the linguistic turn in philosophy. So, if we're going to do that, if we're going to think about this relationship between thought and the world, and then say, well, let's do that by looking at the relationship between language and the world, we want to focus on the expressions in language that do link us up to the world most directly. Things like proper names, definite descriptions, demonstratives like this and that. And we're going to think of then, more broadly, the theory of reference, the theory of those connections between language and the world, as really a central philosophical problem. So ever since Russell, philosophers have tended to think, at least philosophers in the analytic tradition have tended to think of the theory of reference as one of the central topics of philosophy. Now, at first glance, that seems kind of dull, right? Reference, really? Like how the name John Stuart Mill relates to the person John Stuart Mill? That's a big deal. Well, yes, it is, because it's one of the key places where language and thought hook up to the world. So, let's take a look at Russell's theory. Think about a sentence like, in general, the F is G. Okay, the kitten is hungry, or the president is in Washington, or the camera is black. Here is, he says, what that means. You might think it's a simple referring expression, that the F refers to an object in the world, the way a name would, let's say, and so we've got an object picked out, the F, and then we describe that object as G. But he says that's not the right way to do it at all. That's not actually what this is. It's not a simple referring expression. Instead, the F is G is equivalent to the conjunction of three propositions. There is at least one F, there is at most one F, and every F is G. These two, there is, in other words, exactly one F. There is a unique F, and it is G. It would be another way of putting the same idea. I like this poster, individuality. Always remember you're unique, just like everybody else. Okay, so here are some examples. The president is in Washington. That means, according to Russell, there is at least one president, there is at most one president, and every president is in Washington. Okay? Or, the kitten is hungry. There is at least one kitten. My daughter found that kitten up in Georgetown on Monday. So I lose one cat, and then a couple of weeks later, I gain a new cat. Anyway, he's 4 weeks old, and he doesn't have a name yet. There is at most one kitten, and every kitten is hungry.
Did you name the cat?
No, he has no name, so if you have brilliant ideas for cat names, let me know. Russell! There you go. You can call him Berkeley Russell. That would be sort of appropriate. Anyway, now, when I think about the first example here, the president, let's assume we mean, the United States is in Washington. It's entirely plausible to say there is at least one president of the United States, there is at most one president, and every president of the United States is in Washington. Those make sense, right? However, in this case, there's a complication. There is at least one kitten. Well, that's certainly true. There is at most one kitten. How many kittens are there in the world? Just one? No, there are lots, right? And so at first glance it seems like, well, this can't possibly be right, and every kitten is hungry? Well, no, probably a lot of kittens are hungry, but many kittens are playing or asleep, etc., etc. And so we've really, to make this plausible, got to think of ourselves as describing not, at least one and at most one in the entire world, but at least one, at most one, and then every in some contextual domain, in some domain of discourse that we're talking about. So in my family, if we have lots of kittens, then to say the kitten, we're like, well, which kitten, right? But since only one of our cats is a kitten, then we can say the kitten, and the understanding is we're talking about our cats, not just all the cats in the world. Okay, so Russell says any philosopher ought to stock his or her mind with lots of puzzles, because that's how you make advances. You think about puzzles and then set out trying to solve them. So here's his first puzzle. It's a puzzle involving the indiscernibility of identicals. If A is B, then anything true of A must be true of B. Okay? So substituting A for B ought to preserve truth value. And indeed, most of the time, that works out fine. If Russell wrote on denoting, and Russell was John Stuart Mill's godson, then John Stuart Mill's godson wrote on denoting. That seems right, right? That seems to follow from what we have there. If I am the professor, and I say, your paper is due today, then the professor says your paper is due today, etc. However, he says sometimes it doesn't seem to work. Sir Walter Scott, pictured there, was the author of Waverley. That's a novel. George IV wished to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley. We should be able to substitute Scott for the author of Waverley, right, or vice versa. And so it looks as if we should be able to infer that George IV wished to know whether Scott was Scott. But, Russell says, an interest in the law of identity can hardly be ascribed to the first gentleman of Europe. Now, he doesn't look like a guy who's spending a lot of time in the library. Okay, here's Russell's solution. He says, look, as long as you think of a definite description like the author of Waverley as picking out an object in the world in this sort of simple way, then you really have a problem here, because it looks like, well, then there are just two ways. The author of Waverley and Scott is picking out the same object, just like 4 and 2 plus 2, for example, and you should be able to substitute one for the other. If 4 is equal to 2 squared, then 2 squared is equal to 2 plus 2. You should be able to make those substitutions if that's all that's going on. But his solution is to say, look, that's not what's going on. Words and phrases in general only have a meaning in the context of a sentence. And so in particular, something like VF, the author of Waverley in this case, only has a meaning in the context of a sentence. Remember, the author of Waverley is Scott, really means there is at least one author of Waverley, and there is at most one author of Waverley, and every author of Waverley is Scott. And so it isn't the case that we've got this simple referring expression, the author of Waverley. Instead, we've got these three general claims. And so there is really no way to make a substitution, because the author of Waverley actually isn't a constituent of the underlying logical structure. It's very important here that Russell is saying there's a surface structure of language, and in that surface structure, the author of Waverley, like any other definite description, appears to be a denoting phrase. It appears to be a simple noun phrase, a subject of a sentence, for example. But it's really doing something else at an underlying logical form. So we have a little glimpse here of something like a two-level theory. There's language as we ordinarily find it. That's, as it were, the manifest image of language. But there's an underlying level, a logical form, where different things are happening. And indeed, linguists continue to take that idea of a two-level theory very seriously. Almost all modern semantic theories have that sort of thing where there's a surface level and then an underlying logical form. And Russell's really the one who starts all of that with on denoting. So what does Scott was the author of Waverley really mean? It just means at least one person wrote Waverley, at most one person wrote Waverley, and every person who wrote Waverley was Scott. Okay? But notice there is no phrase, the author of Waverley there. So there's no way to substitute the name Scott for the author of Waverley, because the author of Waverley doesn't even appear in the underlying logical form. Oh, there's an image from the original publication of the Waverley novel. Here's the second puzzle, the puzzle of the excluded middle. The law of excluded middle in logic just says Well, P or not P for every proposition P. Okay, either it's muggy outside today or it's not. Either I'm speaking or I'm not. Now, let's consider this instance of it. The present King of France is bald, or the present King of France is not bald. But Russell says, wait a minute. France has no king. So we're not going to find the present King of France on a list of the bald things, nor will we find him on a list of the non-bald things. And so what do we say about this? Imagine we're going to list all the bald things. So here we've got a list of bald things over on the left, right? We're going through, all right, bald, 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 bald. And then non-bald things. We start with Troy Polamalu and Robert Griffin and go along. And it's like, okay, we keep going, bald things. Do we find the present King of France on the bald things list? No. Do we find him on the non-bald things list? No. So what do we do? Russell's joke is, Hegelians who will love a synthesis will probably conclude that he wears a wig. Okay, well, yeah. One way of going about this is saying, oh, the law of excluded middle is false after all, when we have a definite description that doesn't denote anything, like the present King of France. Well, sentences involving it are neither true nor false. Russell doesn't like the idea of giving up basic law of logic in order to solve this puzzle. So he says, to solve it, we have to notice that actually that sentence, the present King of France is not bald, is ambiguous. What does it mean? He says it can have two meanings. It might mean it is not the case that the present King of France is bald. Or it might mean that the present King of France is such that he is not bald. Now, he says one of those sentences is true and one of those is false. What is this one? It's not the case that the present King of France is bald. Is that true or false?
True.
That's true, right? The present King of France is bald, according to Russell, means that there is at least one present King of France, there is most one present King of France, and every present King of France is bald. Well, is that true? No, there isn't at least one present King of France. So when I say it is not the case, that's true. How about this one? The present King of France is not bald. That means there is at least one present King of France, and at most one present King of France, and every present King of France is not bald. But hold on a second. That's not true, because there isn't at least one present King of France. So Russell's analysis is that the first one of those is true. The second one of those is false. Okay? Yeah.
I have a feeling that I just wasted 20 minutes of my life trying to... I don't see the purpose of this, because if there's no present King of France, then saying the King of France doesn't make any sense in the first place.
Ooh, well, okay. Right. What can we say about these cases? One thing you might say is, look, the first thing you might say is what you said at first. Analytic philosophy is a waste of time. Now, I love it. I was a philosophy major, didn't encounter it until I was a senior. And then I was completely seduced by it. I was like, wow, I love mathematics, I love philosophy, this brings the two together, this is awesome. So I was just, I read this article and it was love at first sight, okay? But I realized most people don't read on to noting and just say, I want to devote my life to this. They think, what a waste of time. And so, yeah, that's the first thing. A lot of people would react exactly the way you're reacting. But what about the more specific thing? Phrases like the present King of France. Now that's a bit silly, right? Because we shouldn't talk about that. But there might be all sorts of phrases that can come up that might not denote anything. Okay? What would be some examples where you might say, look, there's an issue here and it's an important factual issue about whether this thing exists, about whether there is such thing as the blah, 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 blah. What could be like that?
Wait, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Yeah. Ordinarily, we say the president, okay? There is a president, so we're all cool with that. But sometimes we can talk about the blank, 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 and actually it's a controversial issue whether there is such a thing, whether or not that thing exists. Yeah.
Could you talk about in like a religious context, talking about like a higher being and like identifying that higher being as one thing or another, where people could disagree with you that it is, if it exists at all?
Okay, good. You might say the Son of God, right? And there might be disagreement about whether there is such a thing. Or you might just say the perfect being. And that seems to be a description of God from one point, well, from I suppose everybody's perspective, except that some people say that doesn't denote anything, right? It's just like the present King of France, whereas others will think it does. Now, if we react by saying, hey, wait a minute, if it doesn't denote anything, it's meaningless, then actually, I mean, is the present King of France, are those words meaningless? Not really. I mean, you know there isn't one, right? Because you understand the meaning of the words. So we don't want the meaningfulness of our language to depend on whether the things we're talking about exist. Not only because of things like that, but how do I tell you a story? I say, once upon a time, there were 3 bears who lived together in a cottage in the wood. The mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear all went on a walk. Then, Goldilocks, in the original by Robert Southey, Goldilocks isn't a young girl. It's an old, nasty lady. But the old woman comes and... Okay. Now notice what I'm doing there. I'm talking about the 3 bears. I'm talking about the cottage in the woods. I'm talking about later the bowls of porridge and so on. The mama bear, the papa bear. Do you say, I've investigated this. There really were no bears who lived in cottages in the woods and ate oatmeal. And so everything you've just said is completely meaningless. No, it's not meaningless. Now, there is an interesting question. Is it false? Or is it just neither true nor false? Think about an atheist reaction to the kinds of things people say in church. Is it false, or is it just neither true nor false? That's, in a sense, the issue Russell is dealing with here. If I talk about the present King of France being bald, is that meaningless? I don't think so, because we know there is no present King of France, so we can figure out what the words mean. On the other hand, is it all false, or is a lot of it just neither true nor false in some kind of ambiguous setting? If it really is neither true nor false, then logic does have to be changed. The law of excluded middle is false. And so we have to change our logic. And there are lots of people who are in favor of changing our logic. Actually, I'm one of them. I think there's truth and falsehood and then all sorts of other things. Like neither true nor false and maybe both true and false. You really believe that? Yes and no. Yeah. Okay, that's a logic joke. I'm getting too clever. Yes?
The first sentence, like, I understand how it's an ambiguity and that's why it's truth, but the wording's kind of throwing me off. Not parentheses, the present King of France is bald, not the present King of France is bald.
Oh, yeah, right. The reason I put it this way is I'm trying to show you that at least contemporary philosophers, starting with Russell, would think this is what is called a scope ambiguity. Is the negation here, the not, is that governing the whole proposition, or is that just governing bald? Am I saying something is not bald, like is hairy, or am I saying something is not true?
So like the not is distributed?
Yeah, exactly. Is the not sort of distributed and just applying to this part, or is the not applying to the whole thing?
Calculus.
Yeah, good. No, it's just like, it's like in mathematics, it's like minus blah, 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 or is it, blah, 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 and minus that? Okay, well, anyway, I can see I'm losing your attention and your patience. So, I'll just say Russell's solution is, look, the King of France isn't on the bald list, he's not on the non-bald list, but, look, this is true, the King of France is bald, or it is not the case that the King of France is bald. That's true, and that's the proper instance of excluded middle. So he says, we've saved logic, the law of excluded middle is saved. When I say the present King of France is bald, that really does have a truth value, it's just false, because I'm claiming in the present King of France is bald that there is a King of France, and there isn't, so what I've said is false. Now, anyway, why is this important?
Truth value is false.
All right, I admit, this is the first time I've tried teaching this paper in the course. This is an experiment. I did this as part of the video for the MOOC. I had to do this lecture about 4 times because the people there who were filming it kept saying, none of that made any sense, start over. You're confirming my earlier judgment that I shouldn't do this. But, yeah, why am I doing it? Why am I putting you through this? There are a couple of ideas in Russell's paper that are really important. One of them is something that has to do with the theory of knowledge. He draws a distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And basically he says some of our knowledge is immediate, and some is inferred from that. Some is basic, we know it directly, immediately. And others we know because we infer it from the other things we know. So there's a level of things that are immediately known by acquaintance. That is what other philosophers call the given. And that's why Hegel refers to this as the question of immediacy. Do we know anything immediately, directly, without inferring it from anything else? Hegel says no, of course. And so here he is directly contradicting Hegel, saying nonsense. There are things we know by acquaintance. Like, for example, that this is black. Or that I am myself. Those are things we know directly. And then there are other things that are inferred from those things. The second important idea, he says really names might seem to be different, they might seem to pick out things in the world, but actually they're just disguised descriptions too. So the general idea is that most of what we say about the world, nevertheless, involves knowledge by description. Knowing that Joe is here, that Jane is working, that the lights are on, and so on. All of that is really known indirectly, inferentially, not directly. Now, why does that matter? Well, only a few things turn out to be known by acquaintance. In other words, there is that basic level of things that are given, but actually there's not much in it. Things like this and that. Okay, so that's cool. I guess that's directly observed, or at least that looks red if I'm looking at the wall in the back and so on. These are things that we might be able to know directly. But he says actually only when they refer to the contents of immediate experience. What does he mean by that? Well, he is attacking Hegel. He's saying, look, we do know some things directly. So Hegel, you're wrong. There is knowledge that we can have without the intermediation of concepts. However, that's the exception. Most of what we know does relate to reality actually quite indirectly. It's only things that are directly before the mind. And he ends up later calling those sense data. Not, in other words, tables and chairs and walls and so on, but just color patches or sounds. Those are the things we know directly, and everything else we infer from those little bits of experience. Okay, well, I will skip to, just this. Yeah, that ordinary objects are really logical fictions. Only sense data are ultimately real. So, he says, what about me? I'm the same way. I'm not real either. I'm a logical fiction. I'm just a string of experiences. Those experiences are real. So the visual impression I'm having right now of each of you, that's real. But you're not real, and neither am I. Okay?
Is that what he's saying?
That's what he's saying. In fact, we know something about, well, that's actually a little bit of a distortion. We're not ultimately real. The things that are real in the world, ultimately real, are just those color patches, those sounds, those little touches, or whatever. That's real. You and I, we're fictions constructed out of that. We know other objects, we know ourselves, we know each other only indirectly. We infer all of that. The things we know immediately are just the contents of immediate experience. Yeah?
So basically just saying that our thoughts are real, but we're not really real?
That's very much like what he's saying. Our thoughts are real, but we're not real. But wait, he was fighting against the idealists. But if the ultimately real things are all thoughts or contents of experiences,
So nothing's real.
that's pretty idealist, right? So here's the way I think of it. Russell is inside this idealist bubble, and he knows he's in the bubble. And he's over there at the edge of the bubble going, trying to fight his way out. And it keeps trapping him, right? I should have a little video here of somebody trying to fight their way out of a paper bag. Okay, and he's trying to do that, and he keeps failing. He's like, oh, I've almost got it. Yes, we can know some things immediately. But what are they? They're those things before my mind. Well, they're kind of mental, aren't they? Crap. That way. And then he goes, well, what about these things? Those sounds. Yes, but those sounds are before the mind. Ah, crap. And so that's what's going on here. Now, at the time, he shocks people because he's trying to get out of the bag. He's trying to get it out of the idealist bubble. But I think as 20th century philosophy has unfolded, we see, yeah, he didn't really get out. He thought he got out. He was kind of like,